Good morning, everybody out there in the miraculous world of internet. Our forefathers would not believe that what we're saying in the confines of this small room, comparatively small room with just a handful of people here, is being heard out there by lots of different people. So we encourage you to interact with us. If we're saying something outrageously untrue to the Bible, you can politely and quietly and deferentially interact with us. But don't get in a fight over an argument between yourselves. We can't even deal with that. So what we're dealing with here is a very simple set of beliefs, because Jesus was a Jew, therefore he believed in God as one person, and he believed himself to be the Messiah. And if you're the Messiah, claim to be the Messiah, and are the Messiah, you're going to rule the world. Americans, I've noted, get very excited about elections. They're passionate about that, but they know nothing or almost nothing about the election of Jesus and the election of you who are Christian believers. You're the elect. You're in training for royal office. You're certainly not going to sit on a cloud and play a harp forever. I'm surprised that people don't shout the pastor down when they're promised some vague, nebulous afterlife beyond time and space in heaven. That's just nonsense. Don't read your Bible with that in mind, because you're not getting the narrative. If you don't get the narrative, you'll soon get bored of the book, by the way. See, if you don't follow the story, it gets very dull. So you start with the premise that Jesus is the Messiah. You are being called then to rule with him in that future kingdom. And that's going to take some violence early on. You're going to rule the nations with a rod of iron, and that's the privilege Jesus extends to us. So I feel like saying every week, this is my open. But if you haven't got that clear, you haven't understood the gospel of the kingdom. All right, here, one final thought before we get into the singing we're going to do this morning. Billy Graham wrote a book on how to be born again. It's probably 150, 200 pages. There's no mention of the kingdom of God in there. Does that get you excited? What? How to be born again? No single reference to the gospel of the kingdom. It's not there. So you have a lot of work to do to help your friends see these easy things. Okay.
So are we online? Are we working?
Yes, we're working. We're doing our mini pre-sermon here. And it's time to sing. Michelle, we're going to sing in just a second. We are in the habit then of reciting the Shema, that's the Hero Israel of Mark 12:29, Deuteronomy 6:4, which goes like this. Listen, Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. One Lord is one person, not three. So the Trinitarian idea is not a biblical one at all. It comes much later. Much better, read the book in its Jewish context. God is one single person. That's the Shema. I'm going to sing a song this morning, I believe.
I sing the mighty power.
Yes. I sing the mighty power of God. Happens to be 71 in that
Is there one more
Church of God hymn.
for Vicky? Yeah. So the internet's start working? I think we're okay.
Yeah.
Yep, we're good.
As long as I don't trip over all that.
Yeah, just don't
Okay, I
hurt
think this
yourself.
is ready. Here we go.
Okay, y'all sing.
I sing the mighty power of God that made the mountains rise. That's where the flowing seas unrock and build the lofty skies. I sing the wisdom and learning, the sun to rule the day. The moon shines on his sky, and all the stars obey. I sing the goodness of the Lord, and fill the earth with good. He formed the creatures with his light, and then pronounced them good. Lord, how thy wonders are displayed, wherever I turn my eye. If I survey the ground I tread, or gaze upon the sky, there's not a
Almighty God, the Father of all creation, the sole God of Israel, the God of Jesus. As a group now, we're recognizing who you are as the supreme creator of everything there is. We ask you to be with us with the operational presence and power of your Spirit, the Spirit of Jesus. We turn our hearts also to you, Jesus, and reflect on the fact that you died for us to be forgiven. We're here only because of that death and the message of the kingdom you brought to us. We ask your blessing on all those out there by the miracle of internet, that we would gain in this next hour a closer understanding of the words of Messiah, which are life-imparting words. We pray for the coming of your kingdom, to the end of the insanity and the madness that now grips the nations, the folly of war, of enmity and hatred and so on, and the chronic diseases that now afflict people because of our ignorance and stupidity. We ask you to be with us now. Send your Spirit to enlighten us, keep us sharp, and give us the fruits of the Spirit by which we can finally enter that kingdom when Messiah returns in power and glory. This prayer is offered as week by week we do it in Messiah's name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, please be seated. As I said earlier, please interact with us by the chat system we have. And if we're saying something you object to, I hope not to do that. But we're going to make very clear Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21. We don't need to read all three chapters. But we're dealing then with the subject that is known by a fancy term. And sometimes fancy terms are unnecessary to make the subject sound more difficult than it is. That is eschatology. That's simply a Greek word eschatos, which means final or last. Logos is the word about it, the science of last things. And in Christian books that people study when they're preparing to be ministers, it's usually the last thing in the textbook. It shouldn't be. It should be the first one. Because the kingdom of God itself, which is the gospel of the kingdom, is an eschatological thing, if you can say the word. It's to do with the future of human history, how this present system ends in the future. And people say, well, I don't want to hear about that. Give me Christian living stuff. I want to know about having a good marriage and so on. That's all right too. Very important, I'm sure. And there's plenty of that in the Bible. I see that. But how dare one say that the teaching of Jesus in Matthew 24, 13, Luke 21, did you even know this morning? Examine yourself. Did you know that the eschatological discourse is in 3 chapters? Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Did you know where the parable of the sower is? You all knew it's in Mark 4 and Luke 8 and Matthew 13. If you didn't, maybe you need to brush up on some of this, because you're not going to be able to teach your friends and neighbors effectively. You yourself don't know the textbook. So this is a challenge to all of us then to know the Bible better so we can deal with it with our friends. Okay, so eschatology is the future of the world. That's something of a privilege. If, for instance, you didn't know the flood came before Moses, you're not very well schooled in the Bible. You know something about the history of the Bible. The flood of Noah, was that before or after Moses? Think about that. Well, you know that the flood came before Moses. You know something of the history. We're talking this morning about the worst time of history ever. There was never a time like it. And there never will be a time as bad as what we're discussing. I don't rejoice in that awful subject in one sense. On the other hand, we're supposed to know this. Why did Jesus give a discourse on eschatology just before he died? Probably on the Wednesday in which he was crucified on a Friday. Very close to his end, he gave this amazing account. So, can we deal with it? Let's see if we can. We started last week by pointing out that there was a temple there. That's a temple that was current in the time of Jesus. That's very clear. And then his disciples, those are his students, you realize that. A rabbi has his students, his disciples, those learning with him. they ask him a question. How does that go? They look at these buildings, those very buildings existing in AD 70, until AD 70 that is, and they say, in response to Jesus saying, not a single stone will remain standing there. It's all going to be torn down. That's a shocking thing to have to say. So his students pipe up and they say, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? That Greek word coming, we do this for our Greek friends out there who know that that's pronounced parousia in Greek. Beautiful language. Modern Greek, it's the same language exactly as your biblical Greek, but it's pronounced differently than they learn in theological colleges. So parousia means the arrival of the king to take over his territory. It's an easy word. What will be the sign of your parousia and end of the age? And last week we pointed out that's one idea. It's not what will be the sign of your parousia and the end of the age. It's more or less equivalent to that, but even more tightly connected. What will be the sign of your coming and end of the age? That's beautiful. And then in your Bible study you say, well, what is the end of the age? Where else is that? It's 5 times in the New Testament. I'll just mention one important one at the end of Matthew 28. Your commission in some way, our commission, however you have circumstances to carry it out, is to preach the gospel of the kingdom, teach them everything that Jesus taught you until the end of the age, until the parousia. You put them together.
And baptize them.
And thank you, and baptize them. That happens to be a current situation with us. There are people out there you would have a hard time believing it, that they fail to respond to the command of Jesus. So that Great Commission I just mentioned, Matthew 28 there, verses 19 and 20, it says, go into the entire world and teach them to observe everything that I taught you and baptize them into the combined name and authority of the Father, you believe in the Father, and also the Son and the Spirit of God, which is their operational presence. There are people out there, earnest Bible students, who refuse to baptize anybody in water. We have to issue a serious warning here. Salvation is given to those who obey Jesus. That's Hebrews 5:9. If you're going to shake your fist at water baptism, you're in very great trouble of being rejected when Christ comes back. Because that's a matter of simple obedience. It's the initiatory entrance point into Christianity, to be baptized. So don't ever lose track of that. If you've been gurued falsely in the past by some crook teacher who told you that water baptism means nothing, or very little, or it's an optional extra, you've been lied to. And you say, my God, I'm so sorry. Let me get this right. So I repeat then, the end of the age is in Matthew 28, and baptism is part of the scheme. Most of you are not arguing with that. But there are a whole group of people who are aggressively arguing it. I'm talking from personal experience now. Aggressively. They're condemning us for teaching water baptism. Don't want to do that. So before I leave that topic and get to our direct session here on Matthew 24, let me tell you that the Greek word baptisma, baptism, always means water baptism. Except a few metaphorical uses, like you could be immersed in suffering. That's obviously not talking about water baptism. So there are occasional uses, very occasional, where baptisma means other than putting into water. But every other occasion, baptisma means water baptism. And this crooked system managed to come up with a lying fraud which said that baptism is only in spirit now, not in water. I'm not going to go into the crooked ways, but beware, you can be taken in. That's why we have to be Bereans. Study the scriptures carefully. Okay, so back in Matthew 24, Jesus then pronounces doom on that temple. You know that was a judgment by God, because they just finished rejecting the Messiah. They're about to kill their own Messiah. Isn't that awful? Those Jewish people, not all of them, they were about to kill their own Messiah. That's an awful thing to do. Kill anybody, right? You don't know what killing people is not what you should do anyway, but killing your own Messiah is an atrocious thing. And the destruction of that temple, 1.1 million Jews were dislodged in 70 AD when the Romans came and took its way. Okay, so it's a major event. But now Jesus is asked about the end of the age. The end of the age, coming and end of the age. Parousia and end of the age. He was asked about that, and he answered the question. So, do you think then that Christ came back in 70 AD? You don't. But many of your friends out here do. Now, I'll tell you the technical term. If you are a preterist, you believe that the second coming happened in 70 AD. That's preterism. That's pastism. It's all over. Now, if you really think that's true, then you are ruling the world, and Jesus is not. There you look, turn on the news, whatever choice you do, Fox News or the other one. You say, well, am I really ruling the world? Are you sure? Are you quite sure that Jesus is ruling the world right now? If you have any doubt about that, you couldn't be a preterist. I'm telling you this because I want you to see how easily it is, and I'm speaking of myself in former years, this idiot standing in front of you right now believes some absurd things, crooked things, wrong things. Why? Because we didn't know nothing about nothing. I must use my
You weren't a preterist,
we were never prejudiced, absolutely right. But we believed other appalling things, and we had no idea of the degree of moral depravity in our leaders. So you want to check your leader out a little bit, make sure he's not into free sex or anything awful like that. So we've come out of that. Now we've decided that preterism couldn't be right, but Michelle is exactly right. We didn't believe in preterism. But many others do. Preterism is pastism. It's all over. The second coming has happened. Now you can be a partial preterist, which means you think that everything short of the second coming has happened. All of the stuff about Jerusalem, all of that's in the past. And that sort of overlaps with another system of thought, which is historicism, and there are varieties of that too. But historicism say that the 70 AD episode is finished. That was the Great Tribulation, according to that system. I'm going to show you, I think, successfully. That's false also. So preterism completely out. The Jehovah's Witnesses began by believing that the second coming was in about 1880. And it failed. So they said, no problem, we'll move it. 1914. I want to make a strong point to you. Don't do this. You are putting yourself under a death penalty if you go around lying to the public about the second coming. You can read in the Old Testament. If somebody predicted something falsely, he died. He was executed. So apparently God doesn't work quite the way we do. We might say, well, these are just harmless errors. They're not harmless errors. They are absolutely punishable by death because you disturb people that way. And before we get to Matthew 24 directly, you remember Paul was very exercised about this. He says there in 2 Thessalonians, you read that on your own, it's parallel to what we're doing. In 2 Thessalonians, he said, do not be deceived by any possible means. A false letter pretending to come from Paul, a lying sermon. Do not let anybody get you twisted or misunderstanding in this area. And he then said, the man of sin has to occur first. Because they were all shaken up, these dear people, in Thessalonica, because somebody had come along and said, well, the second coming is next Monday. It's probably happened yesterday. It's all over or just about set in right now. And Paul goes onto a frenzy. I mean, he's terribly upset. As in Galatians, people who taught that you have to keep the Sabbath. Paul said, I didn't give them space for 1 week. So these are not boring doctrinal things. These are things that can cost you your life, of course. So that's interesting to me. Paul is very exercised, and we should be too.
By the way, the rapture is tomorrow.
Thanks for that.
The pre-tribulation rapture, if you say rapture today in conversation, it must be expressed. We all believe in a catching up to meet the Lord. But there's no noun rapture in the New Testament. There's a verb there. So if you talk about the rapture with your friends, you're creating confusion unless you define your term. So the pre-tribulation rapture, so-called, is coming tomorrow, is that right?
Libido prophecy or Planet X.
Okay.
David Mead, unfortunately an Australian.
Oh, okay.
He got it wrong. It was in September last year. It's going to be tomorrow, April 23rd.
Do we know what time tomorrow? Make sure I'm dressed.
You want to be dressed and ready for it. Yes, okay. So the Jehovah's Witnesses said that it was going to be in 1880. It didn't happen. So they said, well, it's 1914. It didn't happen. So they said it's 1918. It didn't happen. And now they're getting stuck because they also misunderstood this generation, which doesn't mean 40 years or 50 years or 70 years, it means this evil society will not come to an end. So it's a mass chaos out there, isn't it? One other point, Paul said that if somebody tells you that the second coming has already happened, that would imply that the resurrection has happened. And Paul names the people there, Philetus and Hymenaeus. He says, those crooks, doesn't say crooks, but he implies that. These lying frauds are saying the resurrection has already happened. Then he says that's cancer. So if you want to get cancer, spiritual cancer, then you are careless with this material, you get it wrong, and you may be getting the cancer that you're not supposed to get. Spiritual cancer. Okay, with that in mind, then I'm trying to make the point that this is important material. Check it out. I think you're going to like the way we do it as classical pre-mill people. Pre-mill is a long-term. Pre-millennialism means you think Christ is going to come back before the 1,000 years. The millennial camp says that Christ is going to come back after the 1,000 years. And so there is no millennium in your sense. Most of you are pre-millennial people, obviously. So these technical terms have some use, but when you say rapture, you must say pre-trib rapture or post-tribulation rapture. Make clear what you're talking about, otherwise the conversation gets very confused. Okay, any other comments on that from anywhere out there?
I think though,
Yes.
these people understand, what we're talking about here. But everybody to me has tried to figure out a way to avoid the tribulation.
Yes,
In the previous group we were in, we had a certain place, we were going to a place.
that's right. That's right.
Everybody else has this idea, well, if I can get out of here before it happens,
That's right.
or if I can turn around and say it happened,
Yes.
70 AD,
Right.
I don't have to worry about
Yeah. No, that's a
That's
great
true.
point. So if you don't like the future, you put it behind you, don't
it.
you? If you don't like what you see in the future, you put it all behind you. Then you don't have to worry about it. Yeah.
Exit.
Exit.
Escape.
Yeah.
Escape. Exit. Get me out of here. I don't like the sound of this great tribulation. I'm out
Well,
of here.
say it's happening now, it's not so bad.
Right. And then you say it's on right now.
You got good coffee?
Yeah. You hunker down and let it, maybe you hardly notice it. No, I'm here to tell you that the Bible says that the Great Tribulation is the worst time of human suffering ever, by none. So let's just look at that point. Go back to Daniel 12 a moment before we do our Matthew 24 in more detail. Daniel 12 is remarkable. Daniel is a marvelous book, of course. Jesus loved it, quoted from it. And you'll find in Daniel 12, it speaks of the Great Tribulation, doesn't it? What is this? What do you read there? Somebody read that aloud for us, if they would. In Daniel 12, verse 1, can you read that?
Now at that time Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued.
Did you notice the word time occurs 4 times in one verse? That's absolutely without precedent. We're talking about time and timing here in this effort at getting at the truth. 4 times in that verse. And twice you have the expression, at that time. Anybody want to argue with that? You're a child of 2 understand. At that time. You mention an event and you say, at that time something else happened. You're a child of 3 or 4 at least would understand that. So at that time. So you then say, well, at what time are we talking here? Well, you have to go back to the previous verse. That's a chapter break, which is unfortunate. There are no chapter breaks. But if you go back to the previous verse, it's 11:45, is it not? And if you follow the story further back, we won't read all that. There's a very wicked king who begins in about verse 36, and he does awful things, and finally comes to his end in 11:45, doesn't he? He gets done in. He's finished off in 11:45. And at that time, got it? Let's argue about at that time. Let's not. I'm about to solve for you things that people have treated as difficult. It's not difficult. At that time of the death of the last king, there will be a great tribulation. Michael, who is the patron angel of Israel, arises. I think the text puts that fact right there because that's rather comforting. That Michael is still in charge. But it's an awful event that he presides over, unfortunately, right? And it's the time of the Great Tribulation. And then at that time, do you notice twice in the same verse, at that time, the time of the Great Tribulation in this case, what happens? The resurrection happens. Isn't that easy? So now we've got end of the age, got second coming, parousia, and we've got the people of God of all the ages, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and all the faithful are going to come back from death to life. Does that get anybody's interest? We're learning a lot on Fox News watching and other, whatever station you happen to watch. That's not the point. You're learning a lot about extending your life for 10, 15, 20 years. I want to know why Fox News is not dealing with living forever. Come on now. I want to get on Hannity and talk to him about that. Is anybody interested in living forever? You'd think that would be your prime interest, wouldn't you? Or is that just a boring thing? Well, the problem is that churches have taught you're going to go to heaven when you die, so who needs immortality in the future? You don't need it. So forget about going to heaven when you die. That's just false. That's just wrong. As my cousin at Cambridge said, heaven in the Bible is nowhere the destination of the dying. I hope you're engaging your friends in that conversation. So it's quite clear that at that time, twice over in 12:1, is at the time of the death of the last king, 1145. You've got Michael standing up to watch over these events, but it's an awful event. There'll be a time of tribulation never happened before. And when it's quoted in the New Testament, that verse is quoted as follows: there never was such a time, and there never will be such a time. And what else can we say about it? Mark says, in his version, Mark 13, that pregnant women or women who are nursing babies are in terrible trouble at that time, during that time of the Great Tribulation. Okay, so how long do you think that Great Tribulation might be? How about 1,000 years, 2,000 years? Does that make any sense? You're smiling, but most of your friends out there don't understand. It's got to be a short time of agony. It's nonsense to say it's tough on pregnant women or nursing babies for 2,000 years. That's just silly. So when, as occasionally we do, we go to Olive Garden for celebration, it's been my custom as we survey the abundance of food, in America, how spoiled we are. This is not the Great Tribulation. I'm sorry. It gets worse than this. I'm actually making a point against people I argued with for a long time. No, it's a time of dire distress in the future. And it's the worst time of history in terms of suffering. We, as you said, Bob, rightly, used to believe in a place of escape. And certainly, if we have time, we can look at the text in the Philadelphia type of church. And by the way, those churches are not chronologically one after the other. They picture the sort of thing churches do at all times. But those who are staying with the word of the kingdom and are doing well are promised escape from the Great Tribulation. That's not by being taken to heaven. So it's always good to talk about that. Not by going to heaven, but by escaping. If you're in Jerusalem, you can flee to the mountains. If you're in your own house, you go in the basement or whatever. Or you go and see Bob and Kay here, whatever it is. I hope you've got plenty of food stored up. I'm just kidding. I throw that in because we're not trying to frighten people. However, if you are a feeble Christian, you may be in need of being tribulated. This time of trouble is going to sift the good from the bad. So if you're just pretty bad as a Christian now, Jesus and God might say, I'll put them to the test now. If you don't need that testing, then I'll give you a place of escape. That makes sense? I think that's the way it works.
Got some comments.
Please, what have we got?
Milk, no sugar, hence the expression many happy returns. About going to heaven, I think.
Many happy returns. Yeah.
Paul of Romania says Jesus didn't know the day of his return. How can someone pretend to know it?
Correct.
And Tracy says people are not interested. Yes, what Anthony just said, if going to heaven,
yes,
there's no need for resurrection.
Right.
Especially if you're polishing rainbows or preparing heavenly dishes with Billy Graham.
Yes, we're quoting there the icon of American evangelicalism. And Billy Graham wrote this. We have the quote at home. In heaven, to which point you would go at death, of course, in his system, you're going to polish rainbows and prepare heavenly dishes.
Where did he get that?
got one of our audience really stirred up here.
In other words, cleaning and cooking. I don't think so.
That would make everything
Good question.
Maybe Gina has to control her temper.
Yeah.
No, she's asking the right question.
Where did he get that?
Don't question the pastor.
He got it from pagan Gnostic stuff in history, but he really should have been paying attention to the Bible. Our good friend, I have to be kind here, Billy Graham. My dear Graham, I'd like to say, did you ever read the Bible? Because in the book on how to be born again, it's about 250 pages, he doesn't mention the kingdom of God at all. That's amazing. Let's not curse anybody. God is their judge. I see that. But we who have understood a little bit better than that have an obligation to make it known to our friends. So there we are with that. Go to Matthew 24. Yes.
I remember an interview some years before his death,
Yes.
an interview in which Billy Graham was asked whether he had any regrets. And he honestly said, I do wish I had studied more.
That's right. That's a classic quote. Yes, I've forgotten that. Very good. Yeah. So God is his judge, Jesus is his judge. That's fine. But I'm only pointing out that that system does not reflect the Bible. If you're talking about polishing rainbows, going off to heaven, passing away even, you don't pass away. That